Welcome to the Sound for Video session. It is the 2nd of September, 2016. And in this episode, we're going to do a couple of things. Number one, address a question that came up last week from Kevin, the basic filmmaker. And his question was, how come sometimes when I loudness normalize audio to a specific target, say minus 19 LUFS, the peaks aren't always at the same level. The peaks, so sometimes maybe at minus 2 dB, sometimes they'll be minus 4 dB. It all depends. Am I doing something wrong? The answer is no, you're not doing anything wrong. There's an important lesson here. Loudness is very different from peak amplitude. Take a look at this. In this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between loudness and peak amplitude. Let me show you what I mean here. So we have a couple of different audio clips here. You can see they're actually the same audio clip processed slightly differently. The question is, which of these two is louder? You might guess this one, since its peaks are taller. And that is, its peak amplitude is greater than this one. But in reality, if we look at the amplitude statistics, watch this. This one here is sitting at a loudness of minus 19.68. This one is sitting at a loudness of minus 19.50. Technically, this one is a tiny, tiny bit louder, but if we play them back, I think you'll notice there's really no difference. Listen to this.
Well, when I was young, my background of working with my hands, I remember we moved to Arkansas, and
There's the one with the taller peak amplitude. Shorter peak amplitude. Let's play this one.
well, when I was young, my background of working with my hands, I remember we moved to Arkansas, and
Pretty much the same, huh? What's also interesting, if we look at the amplitude statistics, on this one, the peak amplitude is minus 4.58. On this one, the peak amplitude is minus 3.24. So while this one has a larger peak amplitude, that is to say the amplitude is taller on this one, it's actually not really substantially louder. They're both virtually the same in terms of the overall perceived loudness. So what is the lesson to take away from this? The lesson is, don't try to judge how loud your audio is based on the peak amplitude. You always need to come in here to amplitude statistics, go ahead and scan, and really rely on this figure down here, which is the loudness figure. That will really tell you if perceptually this audio that you're editing here will actually sound the same as something else that you've edited or processed in the past. And if your goal is to get something that is perceptually the same, you really need to rely on that loudness. Now, the next question I got this week was about actually a camera. And you might think, well, that doesn't have anything to do with sound. And technically you're right, it doesn't, but it was the question I got, so we'll address it. Mark Latani asked, hey, Canon announced the new EOS 5D Mark IV, and what's interesting about that camera is that it uses a codec called MJPEG or Motion JPEG. What can you tell us about that? Well, Mark, that doesn't sound like a sound-related thing and a light-related thing. Let me kind of explain my perspective on this. It's important because most of us are also shooting cameras as well. We're not just doing sound. So let me talk about this for just a minute, and hopefully it'll make some sense. I don't know a lot about that codec. All I do know is, my understanding at least, is that, and I haven't done a lot of research on this, is that the way that codec essentially works is it saves a JPEG image for each frame, and it wraps it up into a single file container, and that's how it works. So essentially you're getting 8-bit, if it truly is JPEG, and it's not the JPEG 2000 standard, I believe it would just be 8-bit color, wrapping all that up into a codec. My understanding as well, and again, I don't have direct experience with it, so I guess what I'm saying in this is I don't really know. I'm being entirely honest with you. I don't know a whole lot about it. I would say go do some research. But it's essentially a bunch of JPEG files wrapped up into a codec in a single file. I understand it does have to be transcoded to effectively edit it in pretty much any of the video editing apps or nonlinear editors, as they're called. So, but again, I don't have any firsthand experience with it, so I can't speak a lot to it. However, what I might recommend is Andrew Reed over at EOS HD. Knows a lot about cameras, a lot more than I do, and he's a source that I sometimes go to. he has some thoughts. I would highly recommend you go check out his thoughts. He's quite a skeptic, and I think he does talk about the 4K codec. He also, I think one of his bigger concerns has to do with the crop factor, and I would agree. If you were looking for a full frame look from this camera, I don't know that you're necessarily going to be completely satisfied, so that is something to keep in mind. He actually also shoots a Canon 1DC, which also uses the Motion JPEG codec, and he says it's a lovely image. I can say this about that camera, the Canon 1DC. When it first came out, I believe it was either a $6,000, I think it was about a $6,000 camera. I actually consulted for a guy that was shooting with it. He wanted to solve a problem. The problem he wanted to solve was he did not want to record his audio separately. He was doing pieces that required a quick turnaround, and so he wanted a way to record the audio with the Canon 1DC. What I learned on that is that audio input on the Canon 1DC is absolutely awful. It's unusable, in my opinion. So I guess there's the tie-in to sound, at least one of the tie-ins to sound. I would caution you on a few things. Number one, it's really easy to get caught up in the opinions of others. What's really important to do is to take a step back and figure out what things are important in a camera for you. And I can tell you, based on my experience shooting, if I'm shooting as a one-man band doing corporate video, I want a camera that ergonomically works well for me, that I can operate quickly, I can get to where I need to go quickly, I can get it set up quickly, I can start shooting quickly. That is very, very important to me. So don't overlook things like that, because we have a tendency to get caught up in the sensor, to get caught up in the codec that it's using, and caught up in the visuals. And obviously all those things are important, but they are not the only thing. And I have a Sony Alpha 6000. I know that's an old camera at this point. It's been replaced, or there's a newer version at least of the A6300. And the A6000 is only HD, but that is actually a very capable camera from the standpoint that it reads out the entire sensor, and it does produce, I think, quite good HD video. But if I'm being honest, I don't really enjoy shooting with that camera. It's a pain ergonomically. It doesn't work well ergonomically from my point of view. And what I mean by that are a few things. Number one, it's so tiny, which I understand is a big benefit in certain circumstances. And if that's like a number one priority for you, then maybe this is a good camera for you. For me, it's not a great camera for that. It is good if I'm just out with the family, just going out on family activities. I don't have a lot of time to get things up on sticks and sort everything out and so on and so forth. If I'm just going to quickly shoot something, great, fine. But when I'm doing corporate video, I don't use it. I might use it as a second or third camera, but I wouldn't ever use it as my primary generally. It's difficult to use. I find the menu system difficult to navigate, and I find that you do have to get in the menu system a little bit more often than I would like to change things like from autofocus or the focus mode. And that's okay. If you like those cameras, by all means use them. And I guess what I'm saying is that there's no such thing as the ultimate camera or the ultimate camera for a certain price. It really comes down to what you're shooting, what you need. And those are kind of things that you learn about yourself over time and in the particular types of things you're shooting. So that's part of the reason that I don't get a lot into like camera reviews and stuff like that in terms of producing my own. And that's fine. I mean, I know we're all trying to kind of get the most out of our money because we all have limited budgets. And we want to make sure that we really get the most bang for our dollar when or our currency, whatever it may be, when we set down the money for that camera. And I completely understand that. And I've done a lot of that own research for my own shooting needs. But make sure you're not falling into the mindset of just looking at the specs of the sensor and what the visuals look like. Yes, that's very important, but it's not the only factor. Also, you're going to need to consider ergonomics. You're going to need to consider what lens systems you can use. You got to consider, is are the lenses that I'm invested in going to work natively on this camera, or am I going to have to adapt them? And if I adapt them, am I prepared to manual focus? All these kind of things you need to consider. What I find is that sometimes people will go and invest a lot of money in a camera system and then find that they don't really enjoy shooting with it, and they don't find themselves shooting that much with it. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that when the Canon 5D Mark II came out, they went out and bought one, and it sat on a closet shelf, which is sad. I think you should buy something that you're going to enjoy shooting. I know it's hard to tell beforehand. Maybe another thing to consider is to rent before you buy. So anyway, those are just some thoughts there. I think some of the most important things to invest in are audio gear and lighting gear. I think those are probably more important than the camera that you use. Personally, I know that some people are not going to like that statement either, but I think that what it really comes down to is what is it going to take to get to produce what it is you want to produce. If you want to tell a story, what's required there? Do you need a camera that can shoot at ISO 10 million? I don't, and that's why I still shoot with the Panasonic GH4, because the Panasonic GH4 is awful at high ISOs. It's an awful, awful camera at high ISOs. And that's fine, because I light almost everything I shoot. I don't go shooting around in the dark a lot. I don't push high ISOs under most circumstances. Mark, I would go do some research. Go look at what Andrew Reed has to say. Hopefully that's helpful for you. Let me give a little more context for why I think it's really important to invest in sound gear and lighting gear. Sound gear, I think people often fall into the trap of thinking that films or videos are all about visuals. And yes, visuals are important. I don't want to understate them. And I don't want to overstate the importance of audio. However, you really need to consider how important audio is to the overall equation. It's way more important than most people give it credit for. So all of the good microphone purchases that I've made, I can still use them today. And I've started making microphone purchases, 12 years ago. And a lot of those microphones are still usable today. With camera bodies, you cannot say the same thing. Lenses, maybe, if you're still in the same system or if you're adapting to another system where you can still use those lenses. I think that lenses actually are a better investment than camera bodies. But light, you're always going to need light. Even if they start producing these cameras that can see better in the dark than we can, which they already do with the Sony A7S and the A7S II, you still need to light to get a certain look. Just walking around in ambient light isn't always going to get you the look you want. So I think light can do a whole lot more to improve the overall production value of your piece than just always pouring all your money into cameras. And the reason I say this is I think a lot of you are in the same situation I am. I don't have endless money to pour into cameras. I don't have enough money to buy every new camera model that comes out that looks interesting, that's going to be the ultimate new camera. So just be careful. Make sure you check your perspective from time to time. Again, I think that sticking with a single camera for a longer period of time, I think 2 years is a reasonable amount of time for most of us. Even longer than that can be completely reasonable as well. I'm on 2.5 years with my Panasonic GH4. I think that's right around the time it came out because I bought it right as it came out. I'm approaching 2 years with my Nikon D750, and they're both working great for me. There's nothing out on the market in the same price range right now that makes me want to just bail on this camera system and go to another one. And the reason for that is, at this point, I can operate my GH4 incredibly efficiently and get the images that I want because I know how the camera works. I'm familiar with its profiles. I'm familiar with all of its settings. I've invested in all that change, and that camera's more than paid for itself at this point. So those are some things to consider as well. Don't just upgrade because your favorite camera manufacturer introduced a new camera. And Mark, I think you and I kind of gone back and forth about this in email, and I think you kind of came to that same conclusion was, I don't see anything in the Canon 5D Mark IV that's going to suddenly change your world in terms of shooting interviews. Your Canon 6D is probably going to work just fine. Maybe we'll find over time that, as the first reviewers start to get their hands on that camera, that maybe there are some things about it that you're really going to love and it would really improve what you're doing. I'm not seeing it just yet, but maybe there's something there. So anyway, there's my rant. Again, I apologize. It's not necessarily sound related directly, but again, I guess it kind of tied it in by saying that I think personally, again, this is all my soapbox, and I think investing in sound and lighting gear should probably be your first priority over investing in a new camera body. So there are some thoughts for this week. Go ahead and leave any questions that you have. Actually, just send them to me if until next week when we have our next session. We'll probably do a live session next time. What I wanted to do this time was actually do that screen share because that does not work on YouTube Live. And I've just learned that lesson over time for Google Hangouts on Air and YouTube Live. Doing a screen share just isn't going to work. So when we're going to do something like that where I show you something in Audition, we're just going to have to do that as a pre-recorded session. I think that's going to be the best result for you. And that's really my goal, is to do stuff that's going to help you answer your questions and get what you need. And I think that's going to be more important than having a live session from time to time. We will still do live sessions, but they'll just be more Q&A and interactive. So again, if you have any questions, go ahead and email those to me at curtis@learnlightandsound.com. If you hadn't heard already, my dialogue sound post-processing course has launched. It is now available at school.learnlightandsound.com. If you hadn't already heard that, please go check it out if you're interested. The pricing is at $49 US right now, so I hope you'll check that out. We will talk to you again next week, and in the meantime, get out there and record some really great sound.